In this video, we will see how and when the mythical kingdom of Shambala came into existence. To do this, I will read chapter 8 from the book The Forgotten Genesis written by Radu Cinamar. Initially, I thought about summarizing this chapter, but then I changed my mind because I considered it better to read directly from the book. It seems that at the beginning, this mysterious realm was named Anagon, but over time, due to influences from civilizations that developed on Earth, the name was modified. Before I begin reading, I want to mention that at some point, there will be a reference to some human beings called ENL and ENK. I want to explain briefly who these beings are for those who have not read Radu Cinamar's book The Forgotten Genesis, or haven't watched my videos where I talked about them. Although history books do not mention this, the true history is hidden from people. Approximately 360,000 years ago, there were two types of human beings on Earth, ENL and ENK. The ENL beings were tall, measuring over 2.5 meters in height, had a relatively slim and harmonious body. These beings had a very sharp intellect and exhibited paranormal powers due to their highly evolved DNA, which was primarily of extraterrestrial origin. In comparison, the ENK beings originated from primates whose DNA was primarily terrestrial and secondarily extraterrestrial. They were shorter than the ENL beings, and did not possess the same spiritual and intellectual abilities, but had a more muscular body equipped for physical exertion. These beings coexisted for a certain period of time and gave rise to the great so-called mythical civilizations in the distant past of our planet. The legends of demigods are largely born from real events, and refer to human beings with hybrid genes between ENL and ENK, who had extraordinary powers and characteristics. The civilization known as Homo sapiens represents a mixture of the majority branch of ENK and remaining parts of the ENL branch, or hybridizations between them. Therefore, the present population on Earth is predominantly of ENK type. You can find more details about these beings in Radu Cinamar's book The Forgotten Genesis. I also need to make a clarification regarding how Radu Cinamar saw what happened on Earth in the last 400,000 years, and how human beings were created by extraterrestrials on this planet. Radu Cinamar saw what transpired on Earth in the last 400,000 years, through a quantum device belonging to a civilization from within the Earth that is more spiritually and technologically advanced than the surface population. You can find more details about this civilization in Radu Cinamar's book Inside the Earth, The Second Tunnel, and information about the device is available in the Forgotten Genesis book. Now, let's see what the book says about the mythical realm of Shambala. The so-called mythical realm of Shambala is actually an evident reality and quite close to us, denied only by those who have not had access to the truth about it or who lack spiritual inclinations to understand this important subject. In a certain way, it can be stated that Shambala existed even on Earth, at least until its resorption from the surface, approximately 27,500 years ago. We presented some elements about this sacred realm from the center of the Earth in the previous volume of the series, where we described the magnificent structures that we observed from a distance. A necessary clarification. Many people probably wonder, well, if Shambala is a reality, then where is it actually located? Is there a specific place for this realm? Is it truly at the center of the Earth? First, we must understand that these are specific questions for something that exists in the three-dimensional physical plane, characterized by certain laws of space and time. However, they don't make sense when referring to a reality in the etheric plane, which is characterized by 4 dimensions, 3 spatial and 1 temporal. Theoretically speaking, to access something from the etheric plane and the physical plane, there is no specific space. That something from the etheric plane, in our case, the realm of Shambala, can be accessed from anywhere in the physical plane, but it requires a raising of the vibrational frequency in the consciousness of that being. Shambala can be found in the center of the Earth because in that area, spirituality is much more sustained, and it doesn't just appear in a few isolated centers or places on the surface of the planet. However, it would be a mistake to understand that Shambala actually exists concretely in the middle of the Earth, because then one might ask, if it is at the center of the planet, how is it possible to be reflected on its surface, in the world where we live? Therefore, things need to be understood correctly. The world of Shambala represents a frequency of manifestation of consciousness and energy that is very elevated and has a connection with the Earth, with the existence of life here. However, it cannot be said to be above or below the surface of the planet, because that would be a limited approach to the situation. manifesting in the etheric plane, it is not necessary for it to be inside or outside something in the physical plane. People who do not have adequate esoteric knowledge cannot understand these subtle realities, and they tend to apply the laws of classical physics they know to solve or investigate realities in the higher subtle planes. This is not possible. The only way to solve such mysteries is to raise individual vibrational frequency, which means the spiritual evolution of the being and, as a result, the transition to a higher level of consciousness. However, there were times when the realm of Shambhala was relatively easy to access, even from the surface of the planet. One could easily transition from the physical plane to the etheric plane, and some of the most well-known such passages were found in mountainous areas. Tens of thousands of years ago, this was common. The ENL beings had quick access to Shambhala thanks to their elevated level of consciousness, and even some of the ENK beings could reach this realm, as there were many points of convergence between the physical and etheric planes on the surface of the earth, or on water at that time. The Formation of Shambala. A visual synthesis of the history of Shambhala on the holographic screen showed me that it began to take shape much like the birth of a spiritual brotherhood. As I saw in the images on the holographic screen, rudimentary forms of its formation appeared during the period 100,000 BC to 120,000 BC, but without a clear direction. There were territories where only ENL beings, with a high degree of spiritual realization resided. I realized that only highly spiritually evolved beings could live in those areas, as they easily existed in both the physical and etheric planes, meaning in both the 3D and 4D planes. Thanks to them, those etheric lands were intertwined with the physical plane, and ENL beings could transition from one plane to another at any time, which was also permitted for other evolved beings, such as benevolent extraterrestrials, but not for ENK beings. The level of evolution for most ENK beings was primitive, and they preferred to worship the gods, who, for the most part, were actually their kin, belonging to the developed ENL branch. From what I could gather, Shambhala was formed through a kind of spiritual selection, among beings who could enter those areas, intertwined with higher vibrational frequencies in the etheric dimensions, and beings who did not have access, because they did not have sufficiently developed levels of consciousness. In other words, some people could enter and remain in those etheric areas, and others could not. For a long time, the physical and etheric planes coexisted in these areas, because the general frequencies of the two planes were quite close. On the other hand, the connection between the physical and etheric planes was possible, due to the existence of multiple hybridizations between the ENL and ENK branches, at various levels of spirituality, which gave rise to the so-called demigods. These human beings successfully made the transition from one plane to another, and could thus transmit information to and from the etheric plane to the ENK beings. The higher etheric frequencies became the seeds for the formation of what would later become the realm of Shambhala. In these areas, a sacred spiritual aspect of the earth developed, because the ENL beings residing there had a deep understanding of spirituality. After several tens of thousands of years, due to repeated subtle journeys, certain strong subtle connections of various spiritual nature, between the various territories inhabited by ENL beings, were established. These territories were elevated etheric areas, with high vibrational frequencies. They amplified their subtle connections with the regions inside the earth, through those subtle energetic bridge links I have already discussed. Thus, connections were established with all the areas of spiritual refinement, on the surface of the earth and within it. In this way, Shambhala came into being through the unanimous decision of the ENL beings, living in such elevated territories, to maintain a separate identity from the territories inhabited by ENK beings. Apparently, Shambhala is now known as a great city, but in reality, it represents an accumulation of etheric plane areas characterized by high spirituality. As I mentioned, initially, it was formed from multiple areas in the physical plane in which the etheric plane could also develop. When the conditions on the planet's surface, both physical and spiritual, deteriorated, the merging of those etheric areas into harmonious intertwining led to the retreat of Shambhala into the etheric plane. In reality, this meant a dramatic decrease in connections with the physical plane, as I will explain further. The spiritual mission of Shambhala. The initial intentions of Shambhala, to establish a planetary spiritual mission, only appeared after the Great War of Tarsus, which means after 50,000 BC. That terrible conflict, which I could equally name the War for the Conquest of Shambhala, had the primary cause that sacred realm. Of course, Back then, there was no name for it like Shambhala or any other version, at least, I did not notice it in the images. The wise ENL beings living in those territories, who had a doubling in the higher etheric dimension, understood that life on our planet needed support, because the conflicting forces were becoming very strong. The residents of Shambhala began to act in this regard, and even though physical battles continued in the following thousands of years, they were not as intense and destructive. Later on, from what I saw, the period between 30,000 BC and 26,000 BC was marked by long and painful wars. Unlike the terrible conflict between extraterrestrial civilizations on Earth around 100,000 years ago, the wars in this period were fought solely among human beings, especially among the hybridized beings resulting from the union of ENL and ENK beings, as well as those solely from the ENK branch. These were still supported by certain extraterrestrial civilizations, especially after the division of regions of influence at the Great Planetary Council around 27,000 BC. The involvement of ENL beings in those wars was quite limited, as their numbers dwindled. The conflicts were bloody and mainly took place in what is today's Europe, but I did not dwell on that aspect, I only briefly observed those times. The atmosphere was tense, and I could sense the warfare, fleeting images, and even specific battle sounds and weapons. As a result of that tense situation, and the evident decline of spirituality across the entire planet, due to the aggressive increase in the population of ENK beings and the gradual decrease in the number of ENL beings, the Great Planetary Council around 27,000 BC decided that the areas where Shambhala existed should be delimited and separated from the rest of the areas and frequencies on the planet. This way, Shambhala would concentrate most of Earth's spiritual teachings and knowledge. The retreat of Shambhala occurred in two stages. Initially, after the decision of the Great Planetary Council, it was more of a delimitation from the rest of the population, which was predominantly ENK, to further restrict access to its realm. Later, in the final stage, Shambhala was completely resorbed into the subtle etheric plane. This, as far as I could understand, happened around 25,500 BC. With that resorption into the subtle plane, which was the result of the decision made by the Great Planetary Council, Shambhala emerged as a spiritual center, to support and evolve humanity on Earth. Until then, Shambhala did not exist separately. We can only say that there were zones of deep spiritual manifestation in the etheric plane that intersected with Earth's physical plane. The majority of beings populating Shambhala today come from former advanced civilizations, mostly belonging to the ENL branch. Due to their genuine spiritual orientation, they were recognized as such by the rest of the planet's populations. Consequently, Shambhala became the protector and spiritual supporter of Earth. The inhabitants of Shambhala. Even though it represented a spiritual reference point, and the support it could offer to humanity, Shambhala was no longer easily accessible to human beings, not even to the hybridized beings of ENL and ENK. This correlated with the decrease in the vibrational frequency of human consciousness globally. In general, Shambhala only reveals itself when an area on Earth or a being becomes sufficiently spiritualized to resonate with the high vibrational frequency of this sacred realm. Shambhala's exit from the physical plane, where the assistance it could provide could have been much more effective, was followed by another decisive blow, which shattered the last pillar of spirituality and advanced technological level on the surface of the planet. I'm referring to the destruction of Atlantis. The sinking of Atlantis also meant the submersion of our planet in profound spiritual darkness, which was to persist for thousands of years. However, gradually, and at the same time, encouraged and supported by Shambhala, new spiritual centers began to emerge on Earth, developing in various regions around the globe. The problem was that the difference between the frequency of the physical plane of our planet and the frequency of the etheric plane had become too great to allow exchanges of experience between the two planes as easily as they once did. As I mentioned, a human being from the physical plane can only access the realm of Shambhala when they reach, or at least come close to its vibrational frequency level. As for the inhabitants of Shambhala, they are essentially an extension of the ENL gene. However, among these beings, there are also those who continue their evolution on the hybridized branch of ENL and ENK, as well as ENK beings, who have evolved significantly from a spiritual standpoint. I also saw that the realm of Shambhala is open to extraterrestrial beings, who have reached a high level of spiritual evolution. Moreover, collaboration with these beings is closely tied to the future destiny of humanity. Synthesis. As usual, And because I wanted to delve deeper into the subject, I created a synthesis on the holographic screen at this point, to help me solidify the information further. I also knew that I might receive additional details in the process. The images on the screen reconfigured themselves and focused on the decision to form a spiritual center for the planet. The decision was made after 50,000 BC by the Hyperborean ENL beings, who decided to continue supporting the ENK gene, because the human civilization, mainly composed of these beings, still needed significant assistance. Around 30,000 BC, the Hyperboreans established contact with other etheric focal areas on Earth, inhabited by ENL beings, and noticed that the etheric plane was beginning to lose its adherence to the physical plane. They then proposed that the areas of the etheric plane near Earth, which were profoundly spiritualized, unite to form a powerful realm, a spiritual center to support humanity, primarily composed of ENL beings in the etheric plane. The merging of different etheric zones, that intersected with the physical plane on the Earth's surface, was relatively easy because of the common will of those ENL beings. This was possible because everything existing in those areas in the etheric plane, being constructed under the same spiritual rules, attracted and united in accordance with the law of universal affinity. This resulted in an etheric unity, shared by all the etheric areas on Earth that manifested high spirituality. Thus, the spiritual center of the planet was established through the union of these areas. Initially, this new realm was called Anagon, which occurred around 25,500 BC after the complete withdrawal into the etheric plane. Later, likely influenced by different cultures from succeeding civilizations and due to the imprint of time, this center came to be known as Shambhala.